On the morning of August 19th, 1991, Soviet television announced that Mikhail Gorbachev was too sick to do his job. He wasn't sick. He was stuck inside his vacation home in Crimea, his communications cut off by men from his own government. Meanwhile, 8 senior Soviet officials formed an emergency committee, sent tanks into Moscow, and announced that they were taking control. And here's the weird part. They weren't trying to destroy the Soviet Union. They thought they were saving it. The country was coming apart, Moscow was losing control, and the men behind the coup believed Gorbachev was about to make things even worse. So they decided to stop him. 3 days later, their coup was dead. 4 months later, so was the Soviet Union. So how did a plan to save the USSR end up helping destroy it? The answer starts with something that was supposed to happen the very next day. On August 20th, Gorbachev was preparing to begin signing a new Union treaty. This was his attempt to keep the Soviet Union alive. By 1991, the USSR was already in serious trouble. The economy was a mess, Communist Party authority had weakened, and several Soviet republics were demanding much more control over their own affairs. Some wanted independence outright, but the Soviet Union wasn't dead yet. Earlier that year, voters in the participating republics had backed the idea of preserving some kind of renewed union. The fight was over what that union would actually look like. Gorbachev's answer was basically, keep the country together, but give the republics much more power. The Soviet Union would still exist. Moscow just wouldn't get to boss everyone around quite as much. To Gorbachev, that was a compromise. To Soviet hardliners, it looked like dismantling the country while keeping the logo. And these hardliners weren't random angry men outside the Kremlin. They were already inside the government. The group included the Soviet vice president, the prime minister, the defense minister, the interior minister, and the head of the KGB. The new treaty was supposed to start being signed on August 20th. So on August 18th, a delegation arrived at Gorbachev's vacation home in Foros, Crimea. They told him to declare a state of emergency or hand over power. Gorbachev refused. So they cut him off from the outside world and took power anyway. The next morning, Soviet citizens were told their president could no longer govern for health reasons. Vice President Gennady Yanayev became acting president. Military vehicles moved into Moscow. Independent political activity was restricted. It looked like the old Soviet machine was switching itself back on. There was just one fairly major problem. Boris Yeltsin was still free. This part gets confusing because the Soviet Union and Russia were not the same thing. The USSR contained 15 republics, and Russia was the biggest one. So there was a Soviet government headed by Gorbachev, but inside it there was also a Russian Republican government. And since June 1991, that Russian government had its own popularly elected president, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin and Gorbachev were already political rivals. Gorbachev was trying to hold together a reformed Soviet Union. Yeltsin was building an increasingly powerful Russian government underneath it. The coup plotters had removed Gorbachev from the board while leaving Yeltsin free in Moscow. Yeltsin went straight to the Russian parliament building, usually called the White House. Tanks were already nearby. He climbed onto one of them and publicly denounced the coup. That photograph became the image everyone remembers. But the tank wasn't really the important part. The important part was what happened when Yeltsin told people not to obey the new government. Now the coup leaders had to prove that people still would. Crowds gathered around the White House and started building barricades. Russian officials rejected the emergency committee. Some military units refused to move against the resistance. Parts of the security apparatus were unwilling to carry out an assault. The men who supposedly controlled the Soviet state had a problem. They had the job titles, they had the ministries, they had the tanks. What they didn't reliably have was obedience. The hardliners wanted to prove that the Soviet center could still impose order. Instead, everyone got to watch it fail to impose order in real time. Once soldiers and officials started wondering whether they really had to obey, everyone else could wonder the same thing. The coup leaders hesitated. The crowds stayed. The assault they needed never really came. By August 21st, military forces were pulling back from Moscow. The coup was over. Gorbachev was released and returned to the capital. So technically, he had won. Politically, Boris Yeltsin had. Before August 19th, Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union and the main man negotiating its future. Yeltsin was president of one republic inside it. After August 21st, everyone had watched Gorbachev spend the crisis trapped in Crimea, while Yeltsin stood in Moscow directing the resistance. The balance had changed. The Communist Party took an even bigger hit. The coup had been organized by senior figures from the same institutions that were supposed to hold the Soviet system together. When it failed, those institutions looked both dangerous and weak. Within days, Communist Party power was being stripped away. On August 24th, Gorbachev resigned as the party's general secretary and called on its central committee to dissolve itself. But the bigger problem was what the coup had just shown the other Soviet republics. Before August 19th, Gorbachev was offering them a deal. Stay inside some version of the Soviet Union, and Moscow would give you much more room to run your own affairs. Then, the KGB chief, defense minister, interior minister, and other senior officials locked Gorbachev in a house and tried to take the country back by force. Even if Gorbachev gave you more freedom today, what stopped another group of hardliners from trying this again tomorrow? Ukraine already had a strong sovereignty movement before the coup, so August 1991 did not suddenly invent Ukrainian independence. But the failed takeover changed the political calculation very quickly. On August 24th, just 3 days after the coup collapsed, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. Ukraine's own Independence Act explicitly referred to the mortal danger created by the August 19th coup attempt. The people trying to stop Soviet republics from leaving had just given one of the biggest republics another reason to leave, and Ukraine mattered enormously. A Soviet Union without Ukraine would be a very different country from the one Gorbachev was still trying to preserve. The bigger test came on December 1st. Ukraine held a nationwide referendum asking voters whether they supported the independence declaration. More than 90% of the people who voted said yes. Now Yeltsin had even less reason to keep a Soviet government sitting above Russia. On December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a government residence in Belarus. They signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and created a new Commonwealth of independent states in its place. Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union. The leaders of 3 of its founding republics had just announced that there basically wasn't a Soviet Union anymore. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin. Did the August coup single-handedly destroy the USSR? No. The Soviet Union already had enormous problems before a single tank entered Moscow. Its economy was deteriorating. National movements were growing. Several republics were already pushing toward independence. Gorbachev and Yeltsin were already fighting over where political power should live. And nobody can prove that Gorbachev's new Union Treaty would have worked even without the coup. But the timing matters. On August 18th, there was still an active plan to preserve some kind of Soviet Union. On August 19th, the men who thought that plan was destroying the country seized power to stop it. Instead, they weakened Gorbachev, elevated Yeltsin, wrecked what was left of communist authority, and gave the republics another reason to distrust Moscow. The coup leaders wanted to prove that the Soviet center could still give orders. For 3 days, they proved the opposite. 4 months later, there was no Soviet Union left.